People interested in true crime are always baffled by the why. Why would someone do these things? What path in life could possibly have led them to commit such atrocious acts? In this podcast, we aim to explore the upbringings and backgrounds of some of history's worst criminals, but with a twist. Because we want you to set aside what you already know about them, we won't use their names until the end of the show, so you can listen anew and hopefully get insight into the question that haunts us the most. Why did they do it? Join us as we explore the catalyst. The house was nice, much nicer than the pads of the other guys who had taken him home. It had a name, first of all, and the owner told him it even had an indoor pool. It had been ages since he'd gone swimming, so he was excited. Using a spare suit, he played in the pool, anxious for his suitor to make the first move. He then watched as his admirer grabbed a hose. At first he thought it was a game, that maybe using the pool hose was meant to heighten their sex, but he started to struggle, and as the hose tightened around his neck, he slipped beneath the water, victim to a serial killer we will call the Jokester. The son of a successful anesthesiologist, the Jokester spent his early years in the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood of Indiana. There he was joined by two younger brothers, Brad and Richard, and a sister named Barbara. The children were closest with their mother Elizabeth, though their doctor father was not an absentee dad. As the family grew and the father's business expanded, they moved to affluent Washington Township, just north of Indianapolis. To the Jokester, this was a wonderful move. He had been an attentive older brother, playing with his younger siblings, and, according to author Ryan Green, he was delighted to have more space to run around. Green describes that oldest son as a practical joker, always curing his siblings' dark moods with laughter. A caring, sensitive boy, he spent a significant amount of time with his mother as his father was busy working on his medical practice. He seemed to derive some confidence in the rise of his family's fortune. Unlike his younger siblings, he knew that the luxury that surrounded them didn't come easy. It had taken diligence, hard work, and a little bit of luck. As Green says in his book, You Think You Know Me, it looked as if the Jokester was destined to live a charmed life, at least until puberty hit. Puberty is a stage of development when many mental illnesses can present as ever-changing hormones may cause brain chemistry to dangerously change. For the Jokester, the change was sudden. He remained a prankster, but began to care more about his own amusement than that of his friends and family. Once the Jokester reached high school, the disconnection grew even wider. In a school that heavily focused on sports, the bookish teen never fit in with a popular crowd. He showed no interest in the opposite sex, and he never dated in school, but everyone in town was at least aware of him. He was determined that if he wasn't going to fit in, he would at least stand out. And one of the ways he did that was by becoming obsessed with death. If the Jokester had been a less happy child, the sudden shift may have gone unnoticed. But the swiftness of the change in his personality caused concern. He continued to be friendly with his classmates, but their topics of discussion dramatically changed. As Green writes, the Jokester had always been funny and witty, but now he mixed in far more disturbing thoughts, as though he didn't have a filter between the dark recesses of his mind and his mouth. In one instance, the Jokester was playing with a group of boys when he stopped and wondered out loud what urine would taste like. Would it taste better fresh and warm or chilled? When he began to chase his friends, begging them for a sip, they wrote it off as his sick sense of humor. In hindsight, it's weird, yeah, but at the time it didn't cause great alarm. People basically just shook their heads while muttering, "Boys will be boys." When no one reprimanded the Jokester for his behavior, his misconduct escalated. Rather than constantly thinking and talking about doing disgusting things, he began to do them. One of the behaviors typically associated with future serial violence is playing with dead animals. On one occasion, the jokester found a dead crow on the side of the road. Green describes the jokester as reverently stroking the tiny feathers on the crow's stomach before drawing in a deep breath of death. He supposedly pressed on the dead crow's chest, hoping to get even more stench from the bird. That's when he felt the maggots crawling beneath the skin. Green writes that with shaking hands from power, not fear, the jokester crushed the maggots against the bird's tiny bones. He felt a sense of power. It was just him and the bird, and he was the only one still alive. He made all of the decisions. He was in charge. The corpse would lie in exactly the position he wanted it for as long as he wanted it to. Soon the jokester was interrupted by a friend named Bill. Bill watched as the jokester tore a wing off the bird and shoved it in his pocket. Bill was clearly disgusted. Unfortunately for Bill, by showing disgust, he might as well have painted a target on his chest. The jokester slipped a sliced worm into Bill's sandwich one day. His gym uniform was shoved down a toilet. But it was hard to stay mad at the jokester, even when his jokes were really weird and kind of gross. But everyone understood him to be the class clown. When more dead crows appeared, many of them were on the teachers' desks, and everyone knew who was responsible, and they laughed it off. When the jokester urinated on a teacher's desk, the other students refused to tattle. Still, the culprit was an open secret, and the school contacted the jokester's parents. After his parents promised they would get him professional help, the school allowed him to continue attending classes like usual, but instead of getting him genuine help, the parents used his father's connection to create a paper trail of referrals to keep the jokester out of the system. Green writes that it would be years before psychopharmacology would catch up with the needs of someone like the jokester. With his behavior escalating, his friends began to pull away from him. They recognized his behavior was going too far, even for a teenage boy with wealthy, indulgent parents. Teachers were forced to either deal with or maneuver around his issues. His father now made excuses not to spend time with his eldest son. While appalled at her son's behavior, his mother still tried to engage with him, even though the sight of him sometimes reduced her to tears. The jokester soon began to realize that his obsession with dead things was unacceptable, so he hid it. He also recognized that he was sexually interested in other men, which was also socially unacceptable for the time, so he locked that away as well. But he saw comedians being lauded for their jokes. The only problem was he couldn't distinguish between the sophisticated humor of professionals and the crude and disgusting jokes he told to anyone who would listen. When someone laughed, it would only reinforce his belief that those jokes or subjects were okay. When someone told him they weren't, it just confused him. Finding socialization difficult in his final years of high school, the jokester became isolated. With less external scrutiny, he finished his final year in peace. Rather than bringing his dark obsessions into public, he kept them out of sight, out of mind. Hoping for a fresh start, the jokester enrolled at Indiana University, but it wasn't what he had been hoping for. No one knew he was the son of a well-to-do doctor from a family to be respected. Instead, he was just another student from the suburbs. His strange sense of humor and objectionable behavior got him ostracized before the first semester was out. Unable to take it, he gave up and went back home even before classes were finished. Green says the jokester returned to an unhappy father, but whether that was due to the jokester's prospects or because his son was once again his full-time responsibility is unclear. His immediate reaction was to badger his son to return to school, but when that didn't work, he used his connections to find the jokester an entry-level job where, his father hoped, he wouldn't further shame his family. The jokester's first job was as a copy boy for the Indianapolis Star. Still obsessed with getting the approval of those around him, he showed up every morning in a suit far too fancy for a copyboy. Thinking this was his chance for success, he networked at every opportunity with people in the advertising department. When his ceaseless networking began to irritate those at the paper, he adjusted. He was determined to overcome his mistakes of the past. He wanted to be popular. There was still the occasional darker comment or two, but luckily for the jokester, the executive of the advertising department, Gary Donna, had a twisted sense of humor. Because of Donna, the jokester's behavior was tolerated, if not appreciated. When others would complain, the ad exec would wave it away with a version of, "That's just the jokester." Now, Donna could generally tolerate the jokester's humor, but it sometimes went too far even for him. For example, in high school, the jokester had never cared about sports. He didn't participate in it, didn't watch it, nothing. But when he heard that those in Donna's inner circle got tickets to a University of Indiana game, the jokester immediately offered to drive them. The hope was to ingratiate himself into the group, but that backfired when he showed up dressed as a chauffeur and joked about being their servant. As if this wasn't irritating enough, the car the jokester drove was a Hearse. He bought the Hearse with discounts through his father's medical connections. Donna's group was appalled. Donna offered his usual, "That's just the jokester" explanation, but it didn't land. Having blown his big chance to finally ingratiate himself with his coworkers and finally feel popular, the jokester spiraled out of control. He craved positive reinforcement, but it just wasn't coming to him. Not only that, but according to Green, the jokester barely got the respect that was due a copyboy. He was increasingly introverted and petulant with coworkers. It was clear to him that his road to success no longer lay with the Indianapolis Star, so he quit. His father's outrage was worse this time. The doctor had used his connections to get his son this job, so his credibility suffered when the jokester bailed on it. With his ego at a new low, the jokester was ready to listen to what his father wanted and was sent back to college, not for an entire semester, but for one single class, to prove that he was capable of that and worthy of his father's continued help. Given the choice of any class on the semester schedule, the jokester picked a course on human anatomy. While his father took this as a sign his son might follow in his footsteps into medicine, in fact, it was merely the jokester's dark fascination with dead bodies rising to the surface again. He had hoped to perform an actual autopsy, but those hopes were dashed on the first day when it became clear the content of the course was purely textbook-based. Despite that disappointment, the jokester excelled in the course, especially when he refocused his energy on his studies instead of socialization. Of course, that meant fewer people saw or knew about his personality traits. Instead, he looked like a studious young man who dutifully attended classes in ironed suits. But at night, he began to explore a side of his personality that he had long suppressed. With a newfound confidence, he started visiting Indianapolis's gay and drag bars. Leaving his recognizable Hearse at home, he used public transportation to avoid being noticed. On his infrequent visits, he found a vibrant community of people that, according to Green, the jokester could have found a kinship with if he had been willing to give up on his obsession with popularity and ambition. Soon, the jokester began to visit more and more often and made friends with the other regulars. But his father noticed his long absences and wanted to know where he was spending his time. With his deepest secret threatened, the jokester chose an extracurricular activity that suited his interests and, more importantly, would please his dad. He joined the Young Republicans Club on campus. In a twist, the jokester had what Green calls extreme right-wing politics that clashed with his compartmentalized life, but made him a great fit for the group. Additionally, the club respected the wealth and power of his family. The jokester felt like things were shifting back into their proper place. It was while attending a club meeting that he met Juliana Sater, a high school English teacher who was also a part-time student at the university. Juliana, who went by Julie, thought the jokester was handsome and discovered they shared an interest in cars and politics. Seeing himself at a crossroads, the jokester considered his options. The quote-unquote good road meant marrying Julie and pursuing the American dream, just like his dad wanted. The bad road allowed for indulging his various hidden, compartmentalized personas. Hoping the good road would lead him away from temptation, he cut off all ties to the LGBTQIA community and began dating Julie. Confident in his newfound sense of normalcy, the jokester stood up to his father, telling him he didn't have interest in continuing to pursue a degree that held no bearing on the life he wanted. In truth, what he wanted was to get rich, richer than his father had ever been, and according to Green, that helped him fit in further with the young conservatives coming of age during the 1970s. This also gave the jokester a new goal, to challenge his father, hoping to outdo the man who had stood over him his entire life. To further prove himself to his parents, the jokester brought Julie home to meet them. His father was delighted, seeing this as proof his son was finally getting his life in order. While the jokester wanted to strike out on his own to prove himself, he found it hard to do it without his father's connections. Lucky for him, Dad arranged several interviews. To each, the jokester would arrive well-dressed and clean-shaved, but he always seemed to rub the interviewers the wrong way anyway. He looked good on paper, but in person, the jokester gave an air of instability. Soon, his relationship with Julie was the only stable thing in his life, especially as his connections with his parents broke down with his ever-growing pile of failed interviews. With little else to cling to, the jokester proposed to Julie, and they married in November of 1971 at the United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. Through the wedding, the jokester gained not only a bride, but a better reputation amongst the elite of Indianapolis. Among the guests were many of his parents' friends, those who only knew him as a weird kid from high school. Again, this bolstered his confidence and provided him a new demeanor, which won the crowd over, and after the wedding, interview offers began to arrive regularly. There was no reason to believe the jokester wouldn't find work soon. With a small gift from his parents, Julie's teaching pay, and the prospect of a job, the newlyweds bought a house in the suburbs to settle down. Here's where the jokester ran into a huge, unavoidable problem: sex. During their courtship, he and Julie had remained chaste because of their strict Christian beliefs, or so he said, but now they were married and expected to start a family. Aside from this, according to author Green, they were a perfect couple, in that they were perfectly codependent. They spent all of their time together, which immensely helped the jokester from falling back into bad habits. They worked in their yard, making it a showcase. Inside, he doted on his new wife in every way but one. He changed his clothes in the bathroom, making sure he was never naked in the same room with her. The bedroom was a dead zone. Not understanding, Julie tried time and again to seduce her husband, but he could barely contain his revulsion at her naked body. The constant tension between them began to take a heavy toll on the jokester's mental health, and 6 months into their marriage, with Julie's permission, his father had him committed to a mental health facility. Soon after the jokester's arrival, doctors realized that this was not a simple case of depression. Initially diagnosing him with schizophrenia, the doctors believed he used his compartmentalization as a way to protect himself from hallucinations and harmful ideations. For the jokester, he felt nothing but relief. He felt everything that he had been feeling his entire life was not his responsibility. As Green says, it wasn't he who wanted to have sex with men or hurt people or animals. It was something wrong inside his brain. The jokester saw himself as harmless. The sickness was his problem. This was enough to lift his depression and break the cycle of stress he had been dealing with for decades. The jokester's father was worried about the public perception and had him discharged from the facility after seeing him make even slight improvements. When the jokester returned home, his good mood did continue. He was even able to have sex with Julie for the first time, though he didn't allow his wife to see him naked and insisted that they do the act in complete darkness. Julie believed this was left over from his prudish school days, but since they were finally living as man and wife, she didn't care much. Feeling little to no responsibility for his impulses, the jokester once again began to frequent gay bars and have sex with men for the first time. There was occasionally overlap between his lives. One year, he gave out Christmas cards that featured a picture of him with a drag queen, which led to whispers that the jokester himself might be gay. He also got a job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, where he excelled. This new detail-oriented job allowed Julie to focus on starting a family, something the jokester wasn't interested in, at least in the beginning, but the couple did have 3 children, the first being born in 1979 and the last in 1984. Now, Julie would later say that she and her husband only had sex 6 times in total, so it wasn't what we would consider a totally normal relationship, but both of them seemed to be happy. According to Green, the jokester expected that he would be a distant father, but he ended up doting on their 2 daughters and son. Initially, the jokester got along with his co-workers at the BMV, but soon his angry instincts rose to the surface. He would often berate his co-workers for what he considered shoddy work. He considered his work to be perfect, and theirs less than. Promoted after a decade, he thrived as a supervisor, but not as an employee. He had difficulty dealing with his own supervisor, leading him to return to an old habit: urinating on his boss's desk. As you can imagine, he was soon out of a job. Once again, the jokester's father felt compelled to help find a job for his errant son. This time, after so many failed inquiries, he found him a job as a sales clerk in a thrift store. Far from what the jokester wanted to do and believing his talents were being wasted, he became further disgruntled. He saw areas where the business could be improved, but his new boss was actively discouraging him from doing any of them. 2 years after beginning the job at the thrift store, the jokester's father died. Surely, this took an emotional toll in and of itself, but it was also more complicated for the jokester because he desperately wanted his father to see him grow and become more successful and wealthier than he'd ever been. On the other hand, however, it meant that the one person the jokester was most worried about learning about his darkest impulses was gone, and so was that guardrail. With a heightened ambition, the jokester decided that if his boss at the thrift store wouldn't recognize the brilliance of his ideas, he would simply start his own store. Happily taking a check from his mother for $4,000, which translates to nearly $11,000 today, he and Julie found a location and local charities that were interested in supporting them. Excited by their new venture, he quit his job as the two started preparing the store. Landing a prime location, their store, Save-A-Lot Thrift Store, opened its doors in 1988 with the backing of the Children's Bureau of Indianapolis. Benefiting local families, the store sold household goods, clothing, and other secondhand items, but stood out from other thrift stores by being meticulously clean and organized. In their first year, they turned a profit of $50,000, a figure that pleased both the couple and the administrators of the children's charity. By the second year, they were able to open a second location, with the jokester and Julie each running a store. In the third year, they hired staff to run their stores, while the couple moved out of the city to a large horse farm called Fox Hollow Farms. The house had 4 bedrooms, a riding stable, an indoor pool, an in-law suite, and was spread over 18 acres. The acreage had been a big draw for Julie, lots of land for the children to play. But in 1994, their 13-year-old son found a complete, partially buried human skeleton in their backyard. Not only that, but according to People magazine, he picked up the skull and brought it to his mother. Horrified, she asked the jokester what it was doing there. How did a skeleton come to be partially buried under a bush in their yard? The jokester explained it away by saying it was one of his father's old anatomy skeletons, one that had hung in his father's offices for years. After his father's death, it had been sitting in their garage, and while cleaning, he had decided to chuck it into the yard. Rather than calling the police, Julie accepted this answer, choosing not to rock the boat of their seemingly happy life. Around May 1993, so nearly a year before the jokester's son found the body in the backyard, several gay men had begun disappearing from various bars in Indianapolis. Police had investigated, but without any remains, they had very few leads. Detectives finally had a breakthrough when they were contacted in 1994 by Tony Harris, who claimed to have been attacked by a man he had met at a gay bar who called himself Brian Smart. Harris met Smart at the 501 Club and went back to Smart's mansion to have sex. Harris told detectives that Smart had introduced a pool hose into the action for erotic asphyxiation, but it soon became clear that wasn't what the hose was for. Realizing Smart was trying to kill him, Harris said he faked passing out, which caused Smart's guard to go down just enough that Harris managed to escape. Soon after, Harris recognized some similarities between his close encounter and the disappearance of his friend, Roger Goodlett, who was last seen July 22, 1994. But there was little police could do without an identity, and Harris couldn't remember how to find the mansion he had been taken to. So Harris decided to frequent Indianapolis's gay bars with the sole purpose of finding Smart and getting something the police could use to identify the jokester. Finally, in August 1995, Harris saw the jokester and got his license plate number. Now, the police knew the jokester's real name. When the police came knocking, the jokester and Julie refused to allow them to search Fox Hollow Farm. A license plate was hardly enough for an arrest warrant. Julie would deny the police's request for consent a second time. But the jokester was becoming more and more erratic after that visit, hoarding things from their stores in their home and taking sudden vacations. By June of 1996, Julie had enough. She filed for divorce and consented to the farm being searched by Indianapolis police while the jokester was out of town. Police spent 2 weeks searching the farm, eventually finding thousands of bone fragments. According to the Chillicothe Gazette, the forensic pathologist assigned to the case managed to identify 8 victims, with 3 additional victims still left unknown. With a warrant now issued for his arrest, the jokester fled to Ontario. While sitting in Pinery Provincial Park by Lake Huron, he wrote a 3-page note on yellow paper. In it, he said he felt badly about messing up his marriage and his failing business. He mentioned nothing of the bodies on his property. After he finished the note, the jokester died by suicide. As of 2024, more than 10,000 pieces of bone have been recovered at Fox Hollow Farms. Now, that figure sounds nuts, and it is, but it's a little misleading at first blush. Remember, a typical human body has 206 bones in it, and some of these pieces were multiple fragments of a single bone. Still, it looked to investigators that they were dealing with probably a dozen victims. To date, 9 have been identified, the most recent occurring earlier this year. The known victims are Roger Allen Goodlett, age 33, Michael Frederick Kieran, age 50, Stephen Sperlin Hale, age 28, Manuel Resendez, age 31, Jeffrey Allen Jones, age 37, Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., age 23, Johnny Bayer, age 26, Alan Wayne Broussard, age 32, and Alan Livingston, age 27. According to the Indianapolis Star, the coroner's office is still attempting to identify as many victims as possible. Police are encouraging family members of any young men who went missing from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s in the Indianapolis area to submit a DNA sample for comparison. There's also strong evidence that the jokester was the I-70 strangler, killing at least 11 other young boys and men in Indiana and Ohio between June 1980 and October 1991. All of their strangled bodies had been dumped near Interstate 70. As with the Fox Hollow murders, the victims were picked up in popular gay bars in Indianapolis. One of the indicators pointing toward the jokester is that those killings seemed to end, and bodies stopped appearing along I-70 right around the same time he and Julie bought Fox Hollow Farm, insinuating that he thereafter had a more private place to dump his victims. And who was this jokester? His name was Herb Baumeister, potentially one of the most prolific American serial killers in history, and yet one of the lesser known. A minimum of at least 11 murders are attributed to Baumeister, but it's more likely that his victim count is closer to 20 or even 25. Whether he's less well known because he was never prosecuted or because he wasn't as flashy as his contemporaries like Gacy or Bundy, the crimes of Herb Baumeister must never be forgotten. To research this episode, historian Jen Erdman read Ryan Green's book, You Think You Know Me, The True Story of Herb Baumeister and the Horror at Fox Hollow Farm, as well as contemporary news accounts from People magazine and newspapers from the Indiana and Ohio areas. The Catalyst is a production of Grab Bag Collab, created and engineered by Amanda Rossman and narrated and edited by Amber Hunt. You can support us and our other programs at patreon.com/grabbagcollab. That's GRABBAGCOLLAB. Special thanks to Daisy Egan for being our first pass editor and a collaborator on Grab Bag. Music comes from Soundstripe Inc., my dad, Bruce Hunt, and my son, Hunt Van Benscoden.